Have you ever made a quilt with blocks on point? If you've seen that in a pattern but you've been intimidated, don't worry. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble a quilt with blocks on point. Welcome to Epida Studio. My name is Elizabeth and I help you make beautiful things with quilting, pochage, and embroidery. So blocks on point means that instead of joining your blocks square, they're turned on the diagonal. So if you've seen a quilt with the blocks on point, it might have looked confusing. Do you join your rows with zigzag seams? Well, it's much easier than that. Here's how you do it. So often when we're setting out our blocks in a quilt, we will put them out in rows and columns. And sometimes they'll have sashing in between, but this is the basic layout. But on point quilts mean that instead of having them in a square orientation, they're going to be like diamonds. And so that changes the whole layout. So I have these little squares. I'm imagining it is a big quilt just for the sake of being able to show it easily on camera. And so when they're on point, the rows are different. The rows are actually going diagonally across the quilt. And so you'll have some longer rows and some shorter rows. And so this is the layout of the blocks, but you can see it has these little triangle shapes at the side. Now for sure you could just finish it like this and then do a binding around there, but most of the time we like to fill in those triangle shapes so that our quilt is still square or rectangular. And so there are two shapes. We have our corner triangles and then our side triangles, and the side triangles are bigger than the corner triangles. And if you have a quilt pattern, it will tell you what size you'll need to cut those. And if you don't have a quilt pattern, you'll have to do some fancy geometry to figure it out. So for our side triangles, we want to use quarter square triangles. So I have a square and I've cut it on both diagonals to make 4 triangles. So each triangle is going to look like this. And the reason why we want quarter square triangles for the sides of the quilt is because in a quarter square triangle, this long edge of the triangle is still the straight of grain. The bias edges are these short edges. So that means when we add it into our quilt, then the edge of the quilt is going to be straight of grain. We don't want to have all the edge of a quilt be bias edges, because then it will stretch very easily and it will be probably kind of wavy all around the edge. So we're going to cut our quarter square triangles and put those in the sides. And these are often called setting triangles. I'm losing some of my pieces here. And then in the corner, we want that to be a half square triangle for just the same reason. So I have a square and I've cut it in half on the diagonal to give half square triangles. So just the same way in a half square triangle, this is the bias edge and these two edges are on straight of grain. So that's why we want our corners to be half square triangles. So following the instructions in the pattern that you have, you're going to cut all your corner and side setting triangles. So then it's going to be time to begin stitching the rows. So this corner triangle, that's actually one row. And then our next row is going to be these 3 pieces. So to join that, I would take my square and my triangle and I would join them right at the corner of the triangle to make sure that lines up at the corner of the square. So we can see the edge of the triangle is longer than the square. It does poke out a little bit. That's fine. that's actually how we want it to look. And I would sew this seam, and then I will come back and I will add our other triangle like that. And anytime when you're joining them, if you're confused, remember, just you can lay it out and look at it. So when we're joining the triangles, we want it to look like this. We don't want to join it so it looks like this. You want to make sure that you're joining them in the right orientation. And then our next row will be this row. So we will have triangle, square, 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 triangle. So the middle row is going to have a triangle on the end, and then a bunch of blocks, and then a triangle on the other end. Now for this one, you're not lining up the edges. You're going to center the triangle and the square. So the easiest way to do that is to fold your square in half, or this would be your block, fold in half and finger press so that you've the center marked. Then on the triangle, you fold that in half and finger press. So then you have the center mark there, and then you can align those two center parts, and you can put a pin. You can put a pin right in there to hold it together. And so we can see in this arrangement, there is a little bit of the triangle sticking out on both sides of the square. That's what you want it to look like. So we'll join it that way. And these blocks, we would just join the same way you would join blocks. They're the same size, so you just stitch it with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to join all these pieces into rows and then show you what it looks like. So now I have these rows joined, and so you can see the rows are all different lengths. This one is a short, the one in the middle is quite long. If you're doing a rectangular piece and not a square, then your two corner triangles would not be on the same piece. One would be on one strip, and then the other one would be on another strip. So keep that in mind if you're doing something rectangular. So on point layout is really nice for featuring if you want to do embroidery or applique or some other kind of embellishment, because it just gives you a little different shape to work with. But that's something else to keep in mind when you're laying out the blocks. If there's anything directional, like a directional fabric or a directional embellishment, you really have to pay attention when you're putting the blocks together. So what I like to do is I will actually lay out my blocks, and each time I'm going to join on another piece, I have it laid out. I don't have a design wall, so it's laid out on the floor, but then I can just make sure that everything stays in the right orientation, the same way it's supposed to be. So now that these rows are done, we're going to start to join the rows together. So we would join this corner on the same way by matching the centers. And then these rows, when we're going to join them together, we're matching our inside seam. So it's sometimes easier if you start matching in the middle. And this one is a pretty easy layout because I know red and white are alternating. So I know red and white will go together. But if you had different blocks, you just have to pay attention. So the end triangle goes onto the end square, and then we're just matching our seams, which have been pressed to the dark side all the way down, and then this end triangle is matched to this square. If you're matching pieces like this, just keep in mind that we're not matching the triangles together. We're matching the end triangle to a square, end triangle to a square, and then whatever squares are in the middle. So if pins will help you when you're lining the rows, feel free to use pins. But on this case, for example, I'm lining up this seam, and then I notice that the edge, again, it overlaps a little bit. There's this little triangle poking out, and this little triangle poking out. That's fine. I'm not trying to line up this edge. I line up this seam and then I start stitching here even though the end is not lined up. So I'm going to join those rows and then show you what the final piece looks like. So here's my little mini quilt top all put together. And we can see that at the edges, past the corners of the blocks, these setting triangles do overlap. And so there is a little bit of extra fabric there. And that is our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So then when we add the binding won't cover up the tip of the blocks. It will just come down to the tip so that you can see the whole block. So that is what it's supposed to look like. So turning your blocks on point can make your quilt look totally different. Here are some samples of quilts that I've made with blocks on point. So next time you're thinking of a quilt project, why not try your blocks on point? For more quilting tutorials, patterns, and inspiration, be sure to check out my website, epidastudio.com.